The Zephyrian Institute of Advanced Military Strategy had hosted thousands of guest speakers over its 3-century existence. Admirals from the Crystalline Hegemony, tactical theorists from the Silicon Collective, even legendary commanders from the now-extinct warrior clans of Vega had graced their halls. But never had they invited a human. Professor Kethvar adjusted his ceremonial teaching robes as he watched the transport vessel descend through the pristine atmosphere of Zephyr Prime. The sleek alien craft looked almost primitive compared to the elegant, biomechanical ships that typically docked at the Institute's landing platforms. This human vessel was all sharp angles and brutal efficiency, its hull scarred with what appeared to be combat damage that had been hastily repaired rather than properly restored. "Are you certain this is wise, Professor?" asked Dean Siltharian, her crystalline features reflecting nervous light patterns. The War Department's approval seemed unusually enthusiastic. Kethvar's tentacles twitched in what his species considered shrug. "The humans have been our allies for only 2 standard cycles, but their military effectiveness against the Vorthan Empire has been remarkable. Our cadets need to understand how they achieve such results with seemingly inferior technology." The transport's landing thrusters kicked up clouds of dust as it settled onto the platform. A hatch opened with a sharp hiss, and a figure emerged that made several of the watching faculty take involuntary steps backward. The human was massive by galactic standards, standing nearly 2 meters tall with a frame that seemed to be constructed entirely of muscle and scar tissue. His skin was a deep brown color, marked with what appeared to be ritualistic scarification across his arms and neck. Most unsettling of all were his eyes, a pale blue that seemed to catalog every threat and tactical advantage in his immediate environment. "Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, Terran Colonial Marines," the human announced, his voice carrying easily across the platform despite speaking at what seemed like a conversational volume. "Reporting for guest lecture duty, sir." Professor Kethvar approached cautiously, extending a greeting tentacle. "Welcome to the Institute, Sergeant Rodriguez. I am Professor Kethvar, and this is Dean Siltharian. We are honored by your presence." The human's massive hand engulfed the professor's appendage in what the humans called a handshake. Kethvar was surprised by the controlled strength, firm enough to convey respect, but careful not to damage his more delicate physiology. "Pleasure to be here, Professor. Though I gotta say, when Command told me I'd be lecturing at your fancy war college, I thought they were pulling my leg." Rodriguez's mouth curved in what Kethvar had learned was called a smile, though on this particular human, it looked more predatory than friendly. As they walked through the Institute's gleaming corridors, other faculty and students stopped to stare at their unusual guest. The human seemed completely unbothered by the attention, his pale eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with what Kethvar was beginning to recognize as professional habit. "Your reputation precedes you, Sergeant," Dean Siltharian said, her voice carefully modulated. "The Battle of Kepler Station is already being studied in our advanced tactical courses." Rodriguez's expression darkened slightly. "With respect, ma'am, Kepler wasn't a battle. It was a rescue operation that went sideways. We lost good people there. But you held against a Vorthan dreadnought with only a single destroyer," Professor Kethvar interjected. "The mathematical probability of success was less than 1%. "Math doesn't account for Marines, Professor," Rodriguez replied. "We don't fight the odds. We make the odds irrelevant." They arrived at the main lecture hall, a vast amphitheater that could accommodate over 1,000 cadets. Today, it was packed to capacity, with students from a dozen different species craning their necks to get a better look at the legendary human warrior. Professor Kethvar took the podium first, his voice amplified by the hall's acoustic systems. "Cadets, today we have the extraordinary privilege of hearing from Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez of the Terran Colonial Marines. The sergeant has agreed to share insights into human military doctrine and tactical philosophy." A murmur rippled through the audience as Rodriguez stepped up to the podium. He stood there for a moment, those pale blue eyes scanning the assembled cadets with the same intensity he'd shown in the corridors. Professor Kethvar asked me to talk about human military doctrine, Rodriguez began, his voice carrying easily to the furthest reaches of the hall. The thing is, what you call doctrine, we call Tuesday. Several cadets exchanged confused glances. The human continued, seemingly oblivious to their puzzlement. You want to know why humans are effective in combat? It's not because we're particularly smart or well-equipped. Hell, half the species in this room could probably outthink us on their worst day. Rodriguez paused, his scarred hands gripping the podium. We're effective because we're absolutely, fundamentally unwilling to accept defeat. A young Zephyrian cadet raised a tentacle. But, Sergeant, surely tactical flexibility requires accepting unfavorable outcomes in order to preserve assets for future engagements. Rodriguez's smile returned, and this time it was definitely predatory. Kid, let me tell you about the first time I met the Vorthans. The hall fell silent as the human began his story. Even the faculty found themselves leaning forward, caught up in the raw intensity of his delivery. I was a corporal then, part of a recon team on a contested world in the Outer Rim. We were supposed to be gathering intelligence on Vorthan troop movements. Standard patrol, nothing fancy. But the enemy had other ideas. Rodriguez's eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the walls of the lecture hall, seeing battles fought light years away. They hit us with everything they had. Plasma artillery, air support, a full company of their shock troops. We were outnumbered 15-1, cut off from extraction, and completely surrounded. By any reasonable tactical assessment, we should have surrendered or died fighting a hopeless, delaying action. "What did you do?" asked a Silicon Collective cadet, her mechanical voice barely audible. "We attacked," Rodriguez said simply. While they were setting up their siege lines and bringing in heavy weapons, we went straight at their command post, killed their officers, destroyed their communications, and turned their own artillery against them. The silence in the hall was profound. Several cadets were running probability calculations on their personal devices, their faces showing the disbelief that came with impossible numbers. But the tactical doctrine clearly states that inferior forces should avoid direct confrontation, protested another student. Rodriguez nodded. That's exactly what they expected us to think. That's what every sane military force would think. But humans aren't particularly sane, cadet. We've got this nasty habit of doing what can't be done. Dean Siltharian spoke up from her position in the faculty section. Sergeant, while your aggressiveness is admirable, surely there must be situations where strategic withdrawal is preferable to certain destruction. Ma'am, with respect, you're thinking about this wrong, Rodriguez replied. You're assuming that certain destruction is actually certain. In my experience, there's always a way to win if you're willing to pay the price. And if the price is too high? Professor Kethvar asked. The human was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing serious. Professor, let me ask you something. What's the most important thing in the galaxy to you? Kethvar's tentacles writhed as he considered the question. Knowledge, I suppose. The advancement of understanding. And you'd fight to protect that? Certainly, but within reasonable parameters. Rodriguez nodded slowly. See, that's where we differ. To a human, there are no reasonable parameters when it comes to protecting what matters. We'll fight impossible odds, take unacceptable casualties, and break every rule of engagement if that's what it takes. That sounds like a recipe for extinction, observed a cadet from the ethereal communion. Maybe, Rodriguez agreed. But we've been around for a while now, and so far it's worked out pretty well for us. The questions continued for another hour, with cadets from across the galaxy trying to understand the seemingly irrational tactical philosophy that had made humans such effective allies. Rodriguez answered each query with the same matter-of-fact delivery, describing battles and decisions that would be considered recklessly suicidal by any other species. As the formal lecture concluded, Professor Kethvar noticed something interesting. The cadets weren't filing out of the hall as they normally would. Instead, they were clustering around the podium, eager to continue the discussion. The humans seemed genuinely pleased by their enthusiasm, answering follow-up questions with the same patient intensity he'd shown during the formal presentation. "Sergeant," called out a young cadet from the warrior clans, "you mentioned the humans are willing to pay any price. But surely your commanders must sometimes make strategic retreats." Rodriguez considered this carefully. "Kid, let me tell you about something we call tactical withdrawal. Sometimes we do fall back, but it's never because we've given up. It's because we've figured out a better way to kill the enemy." The cadet's predatory features showed confusion. "I don't understand the distinction." "A retreat is when you run away because you can't win," Rodriguez explained. "A tactical withdrawal is when you move to a position where you can win bigger. We might pull back from a battle, but never from a war." Dean Siltharian approached the group, her crystalline features reflecting concern. "Sergeant Rodriguez, while your perspective is fascinating, aren't you concerned about inspiring reckless behavior in our cadets?" The human's expression became thoughtful. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to make them reckless. I'm trying to make them understand that sometimes what looks like recklessness is actually the most rational choice available." "Could you elaborate on that?" Professor Kethvar asked, genuinely curious. Rodriguez gestured to the assembled cadets. "Look at them, Professor. Every one of these kids has been taught to calculate odds, minimize risk, and preserve assets. That's good tactical thinking for most situations. But what happens when they face an enemy that doesn't play by those rules? They adapt their doctrine to account for new variables," suggested a cadet from the Logical Synthesis Alliance. "Wrong," Rodriguez said bluntly. "They hesitate. They second-guess themselves. They lose the initiative because they're trying to fight a logical war against an illogical enemy." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Many of the species represented in the hall had indeed struggled against opponents who didn't follow conventional military wisdom. "You're suggesting that calculated irrationality can be a tactical advantage?" Dean Siltharian asked. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to refuse to accept that it's impossible," Rodriguez replied. "We humans have a saying, when you're going through hell, keep going." It applies to more than just personal problems. As the impromptu discussion session wound down, Professor Kethvar found himself deeply unsettled by what he'd heard. The human's philosophy challenged fundamental assumptions about military science that had guided galactic doctrine for millennia. Yet their battlefield results were undeniable. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said as the cadets finally began to disperse, "would you be willing to participate in a practical demonstration tomorrow? Perhaps a tactical simulation?" The human's predatory smile returned. "Professor, I thought you'd never ask." The Institute's Strategic Combat Simulator was a marvel of galactic engineering, capable of creating virtual battlefields so realistic that participants often forgot they were in an artificial environment. The massive chamber could accommodate up to 500 combatants simultaneously, with full sensory feedback and pain simulation that stopped just short of actual injury. Professor Kethvar watched through the observation deck's transparent, aluminum windows as technicians prepared the simulator for what had been hastily designated as a special demonstration. Word of the human's lecture had spread throughout the Institute like wildfire, and what had originally been planned as a small tactical exercise had grown into a major event. Representatives from the War Department had arrived overnight, along with several high-ranking military officials from allied species. "The scenario parameters are loaded, Professor," announced Chief Technician Veltar, her multiple eyes focused on the holographic displays surrounding her station. "Standard urban assault simulation, designed for company-level operations." Dean Siltharian studied the tactical readouts with obvious concern. "Are you certain this is appropriate?" "The scenario was designed to test the limits of our most advanced cadets. It's been calibrated for failure rates exceeding 70%. "That's exactly why we chose it," replied General Thexmore of the Galactic Defense Coordination Council, his armored carapace clicking with what his species expressed as anticipation. "If the human's claims have any merit, this will provide adequate testing." Rodriguez stood in the center of the simulator chamber, looking remarkably relaxed for someone about to face impossible odds. He'd been provided with standard Institute equipment, a basic plasma rifle, tactical armor, and a small complement of support drones. No special accommodations have been made for his alien physiology. Sergeant Rodriguez, Professor Kethvar's voice echoed through the chamber's communication system. You'll be facing a reinforced enemy position defended by approximately 200 hostiles. Your objective is to secure the Central Command building and extract 3 high-value targets. Time limit is 30 standard minutes. Rules of engagement? Rodriguez asked, checking the unfamiliar weapon with practiced efficiency. Standard urban warfare protocols apply. Minimize civilian casualties, preserve infrastructure where possible, and maintain communications with command. The human nodded, then looked directly at the observation deck. Even through the transparent aluminum, his pale blue eyes seemed to pin each observer with uncomfortable intensity. Understood, Professor. One question, though. Are your cadets watching this? The senior classes are observing remotely, yes. Why do you ask? Rodriguez's predatory smile appeared. Just want to make sure they're paying attention. This is going to be educational. The simulation began with a soft chime that indicated full activation. Around Rodriguez, the sterile chamber transformed into a war-torn city street, complete with the acrid smell of smoke and the distant sound of weapons fire. Enemy positions materialized in windows and doorways, their defenders taking cover behind makeshift barricades and abandoned vehicles. For a moment, the human stood perfectly still, his enhanced senses gathering information that the simulation's designers had never intended to provide. Where other species would see chaos and confusion, Rodriguez was reading the battlefield like a tactical manual. Movement detected, announced one of the observing officers. The human is advancing toward the heavily fortified eastern approach. That's suicide, muttered Dean Siltharian. The defensive positions have overlapping fields of fire. Standard doctrine calls for reconnaissance and flanking maneuvers. Rodriguez apparently hadn't read the standard doctrine. Instead of seeking cover or attempting to identify enemy positions, he broke into a full sprint directly toward the most heavily defended checkpoint. Plasma bolts erupted from concealed positions, turning the street into a deadly crossfire. The human didn't dodge or seek cover. Instead, he seemed to flow through the incoming fire like water, his body moving with an economy of motion that was both graceful and terrifying. A bolt that should have taken his head passed harmlessly through space he'd occupied a split second earlier. Another shot that would have severed his spine found only empty air. Impossible, breathed General Thexmore. The targeting algorithms should account for evasive movement patterns. They do, replied Chief Technician Veltar, her voice tight with confusion. The human isn't following any recognizable pattern. Our computers can't predict his movement because there's no logical sequence to analyze. Rodriguez reached the first defensive position and vaulted over the barricade with casual ease. The defenders inside had approximately 3 seconds to register his presence before he eliminated them with ruthless efficiency. But instead of securing the position as doctrine dictated, he immediately moved on to the next target. He's not consolidating his gains, observed one of the War Department representatives. Those positions could be retaken behind him. Look at the tactical display, Professor Kethvar said quietly. He's not trying to hold territory. He's creating chaos. The simulation's AI had been programmed to respond to conventional tactical challenges, but Rodriguez wasn't presenting a conventional challenge. His seemingly random movements were actually following a pattern that the defending forces couldn't predict or counter. Each position he struck expected him to behave according to established military doctrine, and each time he violated those expectations in ways that turned their preparations against them. Time elapsed. 8 minutes, announced the computer. Human combatant has neutralized 47 defenders and achieved 60% penetration of defensive perimeter. In the observation deck, several officers were frantically consulting their tactical manuals, trying to find precedent for what they were witnessing. The human's advance had accelerated rather than slowed as he moved deeper into enemy territory. where other combatants would be wearing down under sustained resistance. Rodriguez seemed to be gaining momentum. He's using their own defensive positions against them, Dean Siltharian realized. Every time they concentrate fire on his last known position, he's already 3 positions ahead, using their displaced defensive focus to advance unopposed. It's not just that. General Thexmore added his tactical analysis subroutines working at maximum capacity. He's making them afraid. Look at the behavior patterns of the simulated defenders. The AI-controlled enemies were indeed showing signs of programmed stress responses. Units that should have maintained disciplined fire were beginning to panic, their shots becoming wild and unfocused. Some positions were abandoning their posts entirely, falling back to secondary defensive lines that hadn't been designed to stop an assault from their current direction. Rodriguez reached the Central Command building with 12 minutes still remaining on the clock. The structure was a fortress within a fortress, designed to withstand prolonged siege by conventional forces. Its defenders had been programmed with the tactical knowledge of a dozen different species, equipped with the finest weapons the simulation could provide, and positioned to create an impregnable killing field around every approach. The humans studied the building for perhaps 30 seconds, then began to laugh. "What's he doing?" asked one of the observers. "I believe," Professor Kethvar said slowly, "he's enjoying himself." Instead of attempting any of the dozen conventional approaches to the building, Rodriguez walked directly to the main entrance. The massive doors had been designed to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery, protected by overlapping shield generators and automated defense turrets. Rodriguez knocked. The absurdity of a gesture was so complete that even the simulation's AI seemed to pause in confusion. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, with methodical precision, the human began to dismantle the door's defenses. But he wasn't using his weapons. Instead, he was physically manipulating the defensive systems, turning their own power sources against their control circuits. His scarred hands moved with the confidence of an expert technician, finding vulnerabilities that the simulation's designers had never considered because no rational combatant would attempt what he was doing. "How does he know how to do that?" Chief Technicien Veltor demanded. "Those are classified defense specifications. He's a Marine." Rodriguez's voice came through the communication system, apparently having overheard the question. "We're required to know how to break things. All things." The massive doors swung open with a grinding mechanical protest. Inside, the building's defenders waited in carefully prepared positions, their weapons trained on every possible entry point. Rodriguez stepped through the doorway and immediately threw his rifle aside. "Computer, pose simulation," Professor Ketvar commanded. "Sir?" The human's voice carried a note of mild curiosity. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you've just discarded your primary weapon while entering the most heavily defended position in the scenario. Could you explain your reasoning?" "Well, Professor, those boys in there are expecting me to fight like a soldier. But soldiers follow rules, and rules can be predicted." Rodriguez's smile was clearly audible in his voice. "Marines, on the other hand, don't fight to win battles. We fight to end wars." "Resume simulation," ordered General Thexmore, his tactical curiosity overriding his professional caution. What followed would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. Rodriguez didn't fight his way through the building's defenders so much as he convinced them to defeat themselves. His unarmed presence created such tactical confusion that the AI-controlled enemies began firing on each other. Unable to distinguish between friend and foe in the chaos he generated simply by existing in spaces where no rational combatant should have been able to survive. The 3 high-value targets were extracted with 7 minutes to spare. Rodriguez emerged from the command building with his objective secured and his mission complete, having suffered exactly 0 casualties to himself while eliminating nearly 300 enemy combatants. The simulation chamber returned to its sterile, clinical appearance as the program concluded. Rodriguez stood in the center of the empty space, looking remarkably unchanged by his experience. His armor showed scorch marks from near misses, but he appeared entirely untroubled by what had just occurred. In the observation deck, the silence was profound and deeply uncomfortable. "Computer," Professor Kethvar said finally, "analysis of human performance parameters." Unable to complete analysis, the computer replied in its emotionless mechanical voice. "Observed performance exceeds operational parameters for simulation environment. No valid tactical precedents exist for comparison." General Thexmore's carapace was clicking rapidly, a sure sign of extreme agitation. "Sergeant Rodriguez, what you just accomplished should have been impossible. The simulation was designed by the finest military minds in the galaxy." "With respect, General," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics, "your finest military minds designed a test to see if conventional tactics could overcome superior numbers and defensive positions. I don't use conventional tactics." "Then, what do you call what we just witnessed?" Dean Siltharian asked. Rodriguez considered the question seriously before answering. "Ma'am, where I come from, we call that Tuesday." The War Department representatives were huddled in urgent conference, their voices too low to carry, but their body language suggesting intense debate. Professor Kethvar found himself staring at the tactical readouts, trying to understand how a single combatant had achieved what should have required a full battalion to accomplish. "Sergeant," he called down to the simulator chamber, "would you be willing to discuss your tactical decisions with our advanced strategy class?" "Happy to, Professor," Rodriguez replied. "But I should warn you, most of what I did doesn't make sense until you understand why I did it." "And why did you do it?" The human's predatory smile returned. "Because, Professor, sometimes the only way to win an impossible fight is to make the fight about something other than winning." The emergency klaxons began wailing 3 hours after Rodriguez's simulation demonstration had concluded. Professor Kethvar was in his office, still trying to process the implications of what he'd witnessed, when Dean Siltharian burst through his door without the courtesy of requesting entry. "Kethvar, we have a situation," she announced, her crystalline features pulsing with urgent light patterns. "The War Department has just declared a Code 7 emergency. We're under direct threat." Before the professor could respond, his communication terminal activated with a priority override that indicated a galactic-level crisis. General Thexmore's image appeared on the screen, his armored carapace showing the stress fractures that indicated extreme agitation. "All Institute personnel," the general announced, "we have received credible intelligence that a Vorthan strike force has penetrated our defensive perimeter. Their target appears to be the Institute itself. All faculty and students are to evacuate immediately to designated emergency shelters." Professor Kethvar's tentacles writhed with confusion. "General, our defenses are impregnable. How could the Vorthans have achieved such penetration?" "We don't know," Thexmore replied grimly. "Our early warning systems detected nothing until they were already in system. We're dealing with technology and tactics we don't understand." In the background of the transmission, other voices could be heard issuing rapid orders and coordinating defensive responses. But underneath the organized chaos, Kethvar detected something that chilled him to his core: uncertainty. These were some of the finest military minds in the galaxy, and they had no idea how to respond to the current threat. "Professor," came a familiar voice from behind them. "What's the situation?" Rodriguez stood in the doorway, having apparently ignored every regulation regarding civilian movement during military emergencies. His scarred face showed no concern, only professional interest. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Dean Siltharian began, "you should be in the evacuation zones with the other guests." "Ma'am, I'm not really the evacuation type," Rodriguez replied calmly. "Mind if I take a look at your tactical displays?" Before anyone could object, the human moved to the professor's communication terminal and began accessing information that should have been classified far above his clearance level. His pale blue eyes scanned readouts and strategic assessments with the same methodical intensity he'd shown during his lecture. "Interesting," he murmured after a few moments. "General Thexmore, Are you seeing what I'm seeing? The general's image focused on Rodriguez with obvious suspicion. Sergeant, you don't have clearance for that information. General, with respect, clearance levels don't matter much if we're all dead in an hour, Rodriguez replied. And, unless I'm misreading these tactical displays, that's about how long we have before the Vorthans complete their approach vector. Professor Kethvar studied the data over Rodriguez's shoulder. The human was correct. A fleet of Vorthan vessels was approaching the Institute's orbital position, but their configuration made no sense according to conventional military doctrine. Instead of the standard attack formation, they were deployed in a pattern that seemed to serve no tactical purpose. They're not here to destroy the Institute, Rodriguez said suddenly. They're here to capture it. Impossible, General Thexmore protested. The Institute has no strategic military value beyond its symbolic importance. Rodriguez's predatory smile appeared. General, yesterday you all thought what I did in that simulation was impossible too. The Vorthans are playing a different game than you understand. Explain, Dean Siltharian demanded. The human pointed to specific elements of the approaching fleet's formation. Look at their deployment pattern. They're not positioned for orbital bombardment or rapid assault. They're setting up a containment grid. They want to capture the Institute's faculty and students intact. For what purpose? Professor Kethvar asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Think about it, Professor. The Institute trains the military leadership for half the species in the galaxy. The tactical knowledge contained in the minds of your faculty and students represents centuries of accumulated military wisdom. In the right hands, that information could shift the balance of power in this war. The implications hit Professor Kethvar like a physical blow. If the Vorthans could interrogate or indoctrinate the Institute's population, they would gain access to the strategic secrets of every major galactic military force. The evacuation ships, Dean Siltharian realized with growing horror. They're not trying to get us to safety. They're trying to get us into space where the Vorthans can capture us more easily. General Thexmore's transmission crackled with interference as jamming fields began to take effect. All Institute personnel, disregard previous evacuation orders. Remain in your current positions and await further instructions. General, Rodriguez interrupted. How long before reinforcements arrive? Minimum 6 standard hours, came the strained reply. Our nearest response fleet is engaged with Vorthan forces in the Epsilon sector. And how long before the Vorthans complete their containment grid? Tactical estimates suggest 47 minutes. Rodriguez nodded, as if this was exactly what he'd expected. Professor Kethvar, how many people are currently in the Institute? Approximately 8,000 faculty and students, the professor replied, though he wasn't sure why the human was asking. And how many of them have actual combat experience? Professor Kethvar exchanged glances with Dean Siltharian. Perhaps 50 or 60 faculty members who served in active military roles before joining the Institute. What about the students? They're cadets, Sergeant. Their training is primarily theoretical. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, studying the tactical displays with an expression that Professor Kethvar was learning to recognize as extremely dangerous. When a human got that particular look, reality was about to be redefined in uncomfortable ways. Professor, I need you to gather every faculty member with combat experience in the main briefing hall. Also, I want representatives from each student class, preferably the ones who scored highest in your tactical simulations. Sergeant Rodriguez, Dean Siltharian protested. What you're suggesting is madness. These are academics, not soldiers. Ma'am, 3 hours ago you all thought what I did in your simulation was madness too, Rodriguez replied. Right now, madness might be our only advantage. The next hour passed in a blur of organized chaos that somehow made perfect sense under Rodriguez's direction. The human had transformed the Institute's main briefing hall into an impromptu command center, with faculty and students from dozens of different species working together in ways that violated every principle of proper military hierarchy. Listen up, Rodriguez announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying easily across the large space. In 30 minutes, the Vorthans are going to attempt to capture this facility and everyone in it. Our job is to make sure that doesn't happen. A young cadet from the Silicon Collective raised a mechanical appendage. Sergeant, with respect, we have no weapons, no combat experience, and no realistic chance of success against a fleet-level assault. You're right, Rodriguez agreed cheerfully. By any reasonable tactical assessment, we're completely screwed. That's why we're not going to be reasonable. Professor Kethvar found himself caught between admiration and terror as Rodriguez began outlining his plan. The human strategy was simultaneously brilliant and insane, violating every principle of defensive warfare, while somehow creating a coherent framework for resistance. The Vorthans expect us to either evacuate or hunker down for a siege, Rodriguez explained. They position their forces to counter both responses. What they haven't prepared for is a coordinated offensive action from a supposedly non-military target. You want us to attack a battle fleet? Asked a faculty member from the Ethereal Communion, her energy patterns flickering with disbelief. I want us to make them think they're being attacked by a battle fleet, Rodriguez corrected. The Institute has the most sophisticated sensor and communication systems in the galaxy. We're going to use them to create the illusion of a defensive capability that doesn't exist. Dean Siltharian studied the tactical display Rodriguez had prepared. This is essentially an elaborate bluff. It's more than that, the human replied. A bluff only works if the other side has something to lose by calling it. We're going to make sure the Vorthans have a lot to lose. Rodriguez divided the assembled personnel into specialized teams, each with a specific role in his increasingly complex deception. Faculty members with technical backgrounds were assigned to sensor manipulation, creating false readings that would suggest the presence of hidden defensive installations. Students with high tactical scores were tasked with coordinating communication traffic that would simulate military command structures. Remember, Rodriguez told them as they dispersed to their assigned positions, the goal isn't to actually stop the Vorthans. The goal is to make them think twice about what they're doing here. Professor Kethvar remained behind as the briefing hall emptied. Sergeant, I must ask, do you actually believe this plan will work? Rodriguez's expression became serious for the first time since the crisis began. Professor, I've learned that success and failure aren't really about the odds. They're about commitment. If everyone in this facility commits completely to making this work, then it will work. And if they don't, then we'll find out whether the Vorthans are better at interrogation than they are at tactical adaptation. The Vorthan assault began exactly on schedule, with precision that demonstrated their confidence in the operation's success. Their ships moved into final approach vectors while deployment pods launched toward the Institute's surface installations. Everything proceeded according to their carefully calculated plan until Rodriguez's deception campaign went active. The first Vorthan commander to encounter false sensor readings reporting massive defensive installations probably thought he'd made a scanning error. The second commander to receive similar data likely suspected equipment malfunction. By the time the third and fourth commanders reported the same anomalous readings, the Vorthan fleet was beginning to reconsider their tactical assumptions. They're slowing their approach, reported a faculty member monitoring enemy fleet movements. Sensor readings suggest they're conducting extended reconnaissance sweeps. Good, Rodriguez replied calmly. Fear is a force multiplier. The humans' plan was working exactly as he'd predicted. The Vorthans, faced with unexpected defensive capabilities that didn't match their intelligence assessments, were doing what any rational military force would do. They were gathering more information before proceeding. But Rodriguez wasn't content to simply delay the inevitable. As the Vorthans hesitated, he activated the second phase of his strategy. The Institute's communication arrays, normally used for educational broadcasts across the galaxy, began transmitting carefully crafted messages that painted a picture of a facility under siege, but far from defenseless. Requesting immediate tactical support from all Allied vessels in the sector, announced Professor Kethvar, reading from a script Rodriguez had prepared. Vorthan assault force has been engaged and sustained heavy casualties. Defensive positions are holding, but require reinforcement. The message was broadcast on frequencies known to be monitored by Vorthan intelligence, ensuring that the enemy would intercept and analyze its contents. To outside observers, it would appear that the Institute was successfully resisting the assault and had inflicted significant damage on the attacking force. Movement in the Vorthan fleet called out Dean Siltharian from her monitoring position. They're pulling back to long-range positions. Rodriguez's predatory smile reappeared. They're starting to think this might not be as easy as they planned. The third phase of the human strategy was the most audacious yet. Using the Institute's advanced simulation systems, Rodriguez had created artificial debris fields that appeared to be the remains of destroyed Vorthan vessels. The false wreckage was accompanied by emergency beacon signals and distress calls that painted a picture of an assault that had gone catastrophically wrong. Sergeant, Professor Kethvar said as he watched the Vorthan fleet continue its withdrawal, "They're actually retreating." "They're not retreating," Rodriguez corrected. "They're reassessing." Big difference. As if to prove his point, new contacts appeared on the tactical displays, reinforcements arriving to support what the Vorthans now believed was a much larger and more dangerous operation than originally planned. Additional Vorthan vessels entering the system, announced a student monitoring the sensor arrays. Fleet strength has increased by approximately 300%. Rodriguez studied the tactical readouts with obvious satisfaction. Perfect. Now they're committed to succeeding here, which means they can't afford to fail. "I don't understand," admitted Dean Siltharian. "How is bringing more enemy ships an advantage?" "Because, ma'am, the more resources they commit to this operation, the more they have to lose if it goes wrong. And we're about to make it go very, very wrong." The final phase of Rodriguez's plan activated as the enlarged Vorthan fleet moved into assault positions. Every communication array, sensor station, and defensive installation on the Institute began broadcasting simultaneously, creating a cacophony of signals that painted a picture of desperate resistance from a facility that refused to surrender. But, more importantly, the broadcasts were designed to be detected by Allied forces throughout the sector. What had begun as a secret Vorthan operation was now being conducted under the scrutiny of every military intelligence service in the galaxy. Allied response fleet detected at the edge of the system called out a monitoring station. Estimated arrival time, 43 minutes. The Vorthans now faced a choice: complete their mission quickly and risk significant casualties, or withdraw and admit failure in what should have been a simple operation. Rodriguez had turned their advantages against them, transforming their superior numbers and firepower into liabilities that restricted their options. "They're withdrawing," Professor Kethvar announced as the Vorthan fleet began moving away from the Institute. "The entire battle group is leaving the system." Around the command center, faculty and students began celebrating what seemed like an impossible victory. But Rodriguez remained focused on the tactical displays, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Sergeant," Dean Siltharian approached him as the celebration continued around them. "How did you know they would retreat?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Ma'am, the thing about bullies is that they only pick fights they think they can win easily. The moment you make it clear that winning is going to be expensive, they start looking for easier targets. But they had overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower," Professor Kethvar protested. "By every tactical calculation, they should have proceeded with the assault." "Professor, tactical calculations assume rational actors making logical decisions," Rodriguez replied. "But fear isn't rational, and neither is pride. We made them afraid of losing more than they wanted to win." As news of the Institute's successful defense spread throughout the galaxy, Rodriguez found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from military analysts trying to understand how a single human had orchestrated such an effective resistance. But the humans seemed uninterested in the attention, preferring to focus on the lessons learned. "The real victory here," he told the assembled faculty and students in a post-crisis briefing, "wasn't that we scared off the Vorthans. The real victory was proving that conventional tactical thinking isn't the only way to solve military problems. "What do you mean?" asked a cadet from the Logical Synthesis Alliance. Rodriguez gestured to the diverse crowd surrounding them. "Look around this room. 2 days ago, you all believed that military success required superior firepower, better technology, or numerical advantage. Today, you prove that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is the willingness to do what your enemy doesn't expect." Professor Kethvar found himself nodding in agreement. The experience had challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare that had guided galactic military doctrine for centuries. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said as the briefing concluded, "on behalf of the Institute, I want to thank you for your service. You've taught us more about real combat in 3 days than we learned in 3 centuries of theoretical study." The human's predatory smile softened into something approaching genuine warmth. "Professor, it's been my pleasure. But remember, what you learned here wasn't about tactics or strategy. It was about the courage to act when action seems impossible." As Rodriguez prepared to depart, Dean Siltharian approached him with a final question. "Sergeant, what you accomplished here will be studied for generations. Do you have any advice for future military leaders?" Rodriguez considered the question seriously before answering. "Ma'am, the most important thing I can tell them is this. When someone says something can't be done, that usually just means they haven't figured out how to do it yet. And sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to make it someone else's problem instead." The transport vessel that had brought Rodriguez to the Institute departed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a facility that had been fundamentally transformed by 3 days of contact with human military philosophy. The faculty and students would spend months analyzing what had occurred, but the most important lesson was already clear. In a galaxy where military success was measured by technological superiority and numerical advantage, humans had introduced a new variable into the equation: the absolute refusal to accept defeat, combined with the tactical flexibility to redefine victory on their own terms. The War Department's final report on the incident would be classified at the highest levels, but its conclusions would influence galactic military doctrine for generations to come. Humans, it noted, represented a unique strategic asset, not because of their superior technology or numbers, but because of their fundamental inability to recognize the difference between possible and impossible. And in the margins of that report, someone had written a note in precise handwriting: "Recommend immediate expansion of human military cooperation programs. Subjects demonstrate consistent ability to achieve tactical objectives through unconventional means. Suggest classification: strategically unpredictable." Below that, in different handwriting, was a single-word response: "Approved."